Tonight, beneath a winter sky brushed with moonlit clouds, we step quietly into a moment the world almost forgot. A night when guns fell silent, when fear softened, and when weary soldiers discovered that even in the darkest chapters of war, the human heart can still glow with warmth. Tonight, we begin the tale of the Christmas Truce, a night of peace in the war. A story where cold trenches, frozen earth, and distant enemies slowly transform into a shared sanctuary of music, hope, and unexpected brotherhood. Before we begin, my friend, if you're listening from the U.S., perhaps winding down late at night, from Europe, where the air is a little colder and the evening grows quiet, from Canada, wrapped in blankets against the winter chill, or anywhere else in the world, at whatever hour you find yourself here, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and comment where you are watching from and what time it is right now. Your presence shapes the warmth of this story. Now, breathe slowly. Let the world around you dim. Prepare your blanket, settle into stillness, and allow the soft glow of this moment to guide you. When you are ready, we will drift together into the quietest night the war ever knew. Snow had begun to fall in slow, drifting whispers, settling over the desolate stretch of no man's land like a soft white shroud. The world seemed suspended in a winter hush, as though even the sky hesitated to breathe. Along the ragged trenches, British soldiers curled into their coats, their breaths forming small clouds that vanished into the night. Every plank of wood, every mound of earth, every rusted piece of barbed wire glistened under a pale silver moon. Private Thomas Avery pressed his gloved hands together, trying to coax warmth back into fingers that felt more like brittle twigs. His boots, stiff with frost, bit into his heels as he shifted his weight. Somewhere behind him, a kettle hissed, weakly over a small, struggling flame. The scent of burnt coal and thin broth drifted through the air, mingling with the far-off tang of gunpowder, faint reminders of earlier battles that had torn the ground open like scars. Yet tonight, as Thomas leaned against the trench wall, something felt different. The guns had not spoken in hours. He lifted his head, listening. No rumble of artillery, no crack of rifles, only the sigh of wind sweeping across the field and the muffled crunch of ice settling under its own weight. Even the distant German lines, normally alive with the sounds of machinery and shouted orders, stood strangely quiet. A silence like this was rare, fragile. The kind of quiet that made Thomas feel as though he were hearing the world's heartbeat for the first time in months. He stared upward. The stars were sharp points of light, almost too bright for a night that had seen so much suffering. They shimmered like tiny lanterns, guiding lost souls across the sky. He wondered if the men across the field saw the same stars, if they too felt the strange stillness sinking into their bones. Behind him, Sergeant Callum murmured, "Feels like the whole world's holding its breath, eh, lad?" Thomas nodded slowly. The cold nipped at his cheeks, but beneath it, something warm stirred, small, faint, fragile. Hope, perhaps. He did not yet know that this night would become a memory whispered for generations. He did not yet know that humanity was about to break through the frost. But he could feel something coming, a shift in the wind, a softness in the dark, a pause like the air itself was waiting to speak, and soon it would. The night deepened, settling into a quiet so complete that every small sound felt amplified. The soft rustle of wool coats, the distant drip of melting frost sliding down the trench walls, the slow exhale of soldiers huddled together for warmth. Thomas shifted his gaze across the snowy wasteland, his breath catching in the cold air as he noticed a flicker of movement far ahead. At first, he thought it was a trick of the moonlight, perhaps a reflection in the snow, or a lantern swinging somewhere behind enemy lines. But as he blinked against the icy wind, the faint shimmer reappeared. A tiny glow, unsteady, warm, impossibly gentle, in a world carved by violence. A candle, it bobbed slightly, held by an unseen hand just above the German parapet. For a moment, Thomas could not speak. He simply watched, mesmerized, as the flame held its place against the winter air. It was such a fragile thing, a thread of gold trembling in the dark, and yet it felt brighter than any flare or explosion he had ever witnessed. "Sergeant, do you see that?" Thomas whispered. Callum turned, squinting into the night. His breath halted. "By God, what are they doing over there?" But neither man moved. Nobody raised a rifle. Instead, one by one, the British soldiers leaned forward over the trench edge, gazing across the frozen expanse. The candle flame glowed softly, and soon a second appeared beside it, then a third. Small points of light rising like stars being born against the dark outline of German sandbags. Whispers rippled through the British line. "Is it a signal? Is it a trap? No. Look at their helmets. No weapons." Thomas felt something in his chest loosen, as though the night had reached out a hand and gently untied a knot he'd been carrying for months. He could almost imagine the warmth of the candles touching his face, though they were so far away that only the faintest shimmer reached him. Then faintly, so faintly he thought he imagined it, came the soft sound of a voice, a melody, delicate and wavering, drifting across the still air like a feather. "Stille Nacht." "Heilige Nacht," a German soldier was singing. The tune flowed gently across the battlefield, slipping through barbed wire, past shattered earth, through the breath-warmed air of both trenches. It wrapped itself around Thomas's heart with a kind of aching tenderness. Soon more voices joined, low at first, hesitant, then rising with quiet confidence until the entire melody floated over no man's land like a whispered prayer. Thomas felt his eyes sting. Something extraordinary was unfolding. The war, for a brief moment, felt impossibly far away. And somewhere deep within the cold, the first seed of peace began to thaw. The music drifted like a warm current through the frozen air, threading gently between the trenches and rising above the battlefield that had known nothing but thunder and fear. "Stille Nacht." The words glowed with a fragile serenity, as though the night itself had paused to listen. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, letting the melody settle over him, feeling the cold ease slightly from his shoulders. One by one, the British soldiers around him lifted their heads, their expressions softening. Men who had spent months braced against the roar of shells now stood motionless, their faces touched by a wonder they could scarcely name. Even Sergeant Callum, gruff and unshakable, seemed to lose the hard edge in his eyes. "What a sound, he murmured, almost to himself. "Never thought I'd hear something like that out here." Thomas breathed deeply. The air was crisp, scented with snow and earth, but beneath it he felt something warmer, like the faint aroma of Christmas hearths long left behind. As he listened, memories stirred, his mother humming by the fire, his sister laughing as she hung ribbons along the stair rail, the distant bells of a village chapel on a night much like this one. Then, from somewhere behind the British lines, another voice emerged, this time English, a soft, uncertain baritone joining the Germans across the field. "Silent night, holy night." The British soldiers turned toward the sound, surprise melting into quiet pride. Soon a few others joined in, tender, trembling voices weaving their own verse into the winter air, meeting the German melody halfway between the trenches. The two songs blended gently like two rivers flowing into one peaceful stream. For the first time since the war had begun, Thomas felt the weight inside his chest begin to lighten. Not vanish, never vanish, but soften. As though the night itself was reminding the soldiers that beneath their uniforms, beneath the fear and the duty and the endless mud, they were simply men longing for home. The wind carried the harmonies back and forth, letting the notes linger over the frost-covered landscape. The battlefield, usually harsh and jagged, seemed almost softened by the music. Even the broken trees, splintered by shells, appeared to bow their heads in solemn peace. When the final notes faded, the silence that followed was different from before, no longer tense but tender. A silence filled with breath, with possibility, with the distant echo of something sacred. Thomas let out a slow exhale he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Across the snow, the Germans were still standing with their candles, their figures faint silhouettes in the moonlight. The flamelight shimmered like tiny beacons, guiding lost hearts. Callum spoke quietly. Feels like the war stopped for a minute. Thomas nodded, eyes still fixed on the far-off glow. Yes, it does. Little did they know, the night's miracles had only just begun. The last echoes of the shared song drifted into the sky, dissolving into the stars that glimmered like frost-bound lanterns. The stillness that followed felt almost enchanted, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something delicate and impossible to unfold. Thomas remained very still, his gloved hands resting on the frozen edge of the trench as he peered across the moonlit expanse. Then he saw movement. A single German soldier rose slowly from behind his parapet, the candlelight reflecting faintly off the smooth curve of his helmet. His posture was cautious, hands lifted high in the universal signal of peace. He stepped forward onto the crisp snow, the crunch beneath his boots audible even from a distance. The pale golden glow of his candle swayed gently, illuminating the soft white breaths that escaped his lips. The British line rippled with murmurs. What's he doing? Has he lost his mind? No rifle, or look, he's unarmed. Steady, lads. Sergeant Callum raised a hand for silence. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing, but there was no anger in his expression, only a deep, conflicted curiosity. He watched the lone figure make his slow, careful way into no man's land, each step placed as gently as if he feared waking the earth. And then, from somewhere farther down the German line, another man appeared, and another. Soon, half a dozen soldiers emerged from the shadows, each carrying a small candle or lantern, each walking with hands held high. The glow of their lights shimmered across the snow like a procession of wandering stars. Thomas felt his heart thrum with a strange mix of awe and fear. This wasn't supposed to happen. Nobody crossed the open field, not unless they wanted to vanish in a hail of bullets. Yet tonight, something deeper than rules seemed to guide them, something older than war. One of the British soldiers, Private Malloy, whispered, "If they can walk out there like that, maybe they don't want this any more than we do." Another voice replied softly, "Maybe they're just like us, cold, tired, missing home." Thomas swallowed hard. He could feel that truth settling into him like warmth beneath the frost. A long moment passed as both sides watched the Germans slowly approach the center of the field. Then, with a breath that clouded in the cold air, Sergeant Callum made a choice that none of them would forget. He climbed out of the trench, not with a weapon, not with shields or shouts. He simply stood, brushing the snow from his coat, and lifted one hand, mirroring the German gesture of peace. The British soldiers gasped softly, but they did not stop him. Instead, Thomas felt something stirring inside him, a pull, a recognition, a fragile courage rising like a spark. Before he realized what he was doing, he placed his hands on the icy earth and hoisted himself up beside the sergeant. The cold hit him instantly, sharp and clean, but the air felt different. Now, gentle, expectant. He straightened, heart pounding softly against his ribs, and followed the sergeant's first steps into the open field. The snow glowed beneath the moon as both sides inched toward each other, like two worlds slowly drifting into alignment. History was shifting beneath their feet. The snow crunched rhythmically beneath Thomas's boots as he walked deeper into no man's land, each step measured, each breath a pale cloud drifting upward into the cold night. The silence was immense, yet it held no fear now, only a trembling anticipation, like the world was leaning forward to witness something tender unfold. Behind him, more British soldiers began climbing cautiously from the trenches, their hands raised, their faces lit by the faint shimmer of moonlight on frost. Their boots slid slightly on the icy ground, their breaths shallow but steady. Some carried small lanterns, others simply brought themselves, unarmed and uncertain, drawn forward by the fragile hope forming over the frozen battlefield. Ahead, the German soldiers slowed their steps as they approached the center of the field. Their candle flames flickered with every shift of the wind, glowing gently against the dark wool of their coats. One German soldier, a tall young man with soft eyes and a pale mustache, lowered his candle slightly as he spotted Thomas. For a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other. No rifles, no commands, no thunder of artillery to drown out the quiet recognition passing between them. Just two human beings, the same winter cold in their bones, the same longing for warmth, home, and peace. Sergeant Callum cleared his throat gently, breaking the stillness. "Evenin'," he said, his voice steady, though a faint tremor teased the edges. The tall German nodded once, offering a small, sincere smile. "Guten Abend," he replied softly. "Merry Christmas, yes?" Callum hesitated only a second before nodding. "Aye, Merry Christmas." Thomas felt warmth bloom in his chest, strange, impossible warmth, as the German soldier extended his hand. The gesture was simple, unarmed, astonishing in its honesty. Thomas stepped forward before he could overthink it and clasped the man's hand. The German's grip was firm but gentle, his palm cold but steady. It felt like shaking hands with peace itself. Around them, more soldiers began meeting in pairs and small clusters, hesitant at first, then slowly softening into quiet conversations and shy smiles. Soft laughter fluttered through the air, brief, uncertain, but real. The sound felt like sunlight breaking through a long winter storm. Another German soldier held up a tin festooned with bits of ribbon. "Chocolate?" he offered, his English thick but warm. In response, a British soldier rummaged through his coat and produced a pouch of tobacco, holding it out with a nod. The men exchanged their gifts with an awkward grace, their cold fingers brushing lightly. Thomas watched in awe. The war hadn't ended. The trenches still waited behind them. But in this moment, between the lines, something gentler had taken root, something fragile, glowing, and alive. He looked up at the moon, its silver glow spilling across the field like a blessing. The moon shone softly over the gathering of soldiers, casting a pale shimmer over helmets, greatcoats, and the snow-packed earth beneath their boots. Their breaths curling upward into the quiet night like slender threads of smoke, weaving a shared tapestry. Thomas watched as more soldiers emerged from both sides, walking with careful steps, yet unmistakable eagerness. Some carried small bundles wrapped in cloth, others clutched tins, boxes, or even humble scraps of food. They came not as enemies, but as travelers, meeting at a crossroads, each bringing whatever kindness they could gather from the meager stores of trench life. A German soldier with round spectacles approached Thomas, holding out a small tin box. Inside were neatly arranged biscuits, hard but lovingly kept dry despite the trench conditions. "Bitte," the man said, offering it with a shy nod. Thomas accepted the tin with both hands, touched by the thoughtful gesture. "Thank you," he murmured, opening one side of his coat pocket and pulling out a small, worn photograph. It was of his family, his mother, his sister, and him as a boy, all smiling in front of a decorated hearth. He hesitated, then showed it to the German soldier. The man's eyes softened, and he reached into his own coat, producing a folded piece of paper, an ink sketch of what looked like a farmhouse beside a snow-covered pine. A group of Germans responded by opening a bottle of sweet-smelling wine, pouring it into small metal cups, and handing them around with laughter that puffed warmly into the air. Sergeant Callum accepted a sip and coughed at the unexpected sweetness. "Stronger than our rations, that's for sure," he said, drawing a chorus of chuckles from both sides. The soldiers exchanged buttons from their uniforms, bits of ribbon, coins, and tiny homemade trinkets crafted from scrap metal and wood. Some traded warm gloves for scarves. Others passed along treats saved for weeks, a square of chocolate, a sugar cube, a piece of dried fruit that tasted like a memory of sunlight. Even small items took on a glow of significance. In this frozen moment, anything freely given felt like a treasure. Thomas found himself laughing softly with the German soldier beside him, their breath steaming in the air as they compared the frost patterns forming on their helmets. The tension that had once ruled the front seemed to melt between them, replaced by something gentler, like the warmth of a hearth just beyond a doorway. Gifts changed hands, but something far more precious was quietly forming. A feeling of shared existence, a recognition that beyond the uniforms and the orders, every man present carried a fragile heart beating for home. As the night deepened, the candle flames flickered more brightly, as if nourished by the rare warmth spreading through the gathered crowd. Peace was building itself one small gesture at a time. The field between the trenches had transformed into a quiet circle of life. Men gathered in small clusters, some standing, some crouching in the snow, their breaths rising into the night like gentle ghosts. The wind whispered softly across the frosted ground, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and smoke, but also something new, something warm, like the memory of hearthlight drifting homeward. Thomas found himself sitting on an overturned ammunition crate someone had dragged from the British line, the wood cold beneath him. The German soldier with the sketch, whose name he had learned was Lucas, sat across from him on a flatted mound of snow. Between them lay their exchanged items, the tin of biscuits, the small photograph, and the folded sketch like a bridge joining their two worlds. They spoke in slow, careful words, each sentence pieced together with gestures and smiles when vocabulary failed. Their languages were different, but their stories were familiar. "I miss the sound of bells," Lucas said, tapping two fingers lightly against the air, mimicking their chime. "Every Christmas, my village bells ring. I hear them from my window. This year—" He paused, eyes drifting toward the trenches behind him. "Only thunder of guns." Thomas nodded. "Same for us. Back home, my sister would always wake me too early on Christmas morning, singing before the sun even rose." A soft smile touched his lips. "I'd give anything to hear that now." The men around them shared their own memories of warm kitchens, crackling fireplaces, the smell of pine trees, festive lights, gatherings with friends. Their voices rose and fell like embers caught in a gentle breeze. A British private named Emerson described his father's shop, a bakery that always smelled of cinnamon and fresh bread during the holidays. A German soldier responded with a tale of helping his mother roll dough for spiced cookies, the scent filling their small cottage like a blanket. It struck Thomas how similar their lives had been, how deeply intertwined their hopes and joys remained, even after months of fighting. Different countries, different uniforms, but the same human longing for warmth and belonging. "Do you think," Thomas asked quietly, "our families would believe us if we told them about this night?" Lucas considered the question, his breath curling into the cold. "Maybe," he said softly. "Maybe they would say it is a Christmas miracle." The phrase lingered in the air, hovering between them like a fragile star. A group of soldiers nearby had begun sharing jokes, clumsy, half-translated, but heartfelt. Laughter drifted gently across the snow, warm enough to push back the winter chill. Others compared small tokens from home, postcards, charms, carved wooden figures, bits of ribbon saved from packages long opened. A British soldier began humming a tune, and soon a German soldier recognized it, whistling the harmony. The melody rose into the winter sky in shared repetition, soft and soothing, like a lullaby the world had almost forgotten. Thomas leaned back slightly, looking upward. The stars glimmered above, unblinking, serene, witnessing the quietest, most improbable gathering in a place meant for fear, not peace. Here, in this fragile moment, war felt impossibly far away. Here, humanity breathed again. As the night deepened, the faint glow of candles and lanterns began to dot the snowy field like scattered constellations fallen gently to earth. Each tiny flame shimmered against the still air, casting delicate halos of gold over the boots, hands, and faces gathered beneath the winter sky. The battlefield, usually harsh and jagged, had softened into something almost sacred. Thomas stood slowly, brushing frost from his coat, and looked around at the flickering lights. Soldiers from both sides had placed their candles on small mounds of snow or wedged them gently into spent shell casings, turning instruments of war into fragile holders of peace. Every flame swayed softly with the wind, a living symbol of something shared, something human. Across from him, Lucas raised his lantern slightly. "Schön, ja," he said, his eyes glowing with reflected light. "Beautiful." Thomas nodded. The lantern's warmth illuminated Lucas's features, making him look less like a soldier and more like the artist he truly was, gentle, thoughtful, a young man caught in a story far larger than he ever meant to be part of. Around them, soldiers began arranging their lights into small patterns, circles, lines, tiny clusters. One British soldier carefully set his candle beside a German one, their flames leaning toward each other like two friends whispering secrets. A soft murmur of appreciation drifted through the crowd. The lanterns weren't just lights, they were beacons of trust. A group of Scottish soldiers contributed their own gestures of camaraderie. They brought out a small battered tin drum. A German soldier responded by producing a mouth harmonica from his pocket, lifting it to his lips and playing a simple, wistful melody that floated through the night like a winter breeze carrying memories. The music mingled with the low drum beat, weaving through the lantern-lit air with a quiet beauty. Soldiers gathered closer, leaning in to listen, their voices hushed as though afraid to break the spell settling around them. Thomas felt an ache in his chest, not a painful one, but the deep, tender ache of witnessing something rare and fragile. Even the twisted wire seemed gentler in the candlelight, its harsh lines softened into curves of silver. It no longer looked like a boundary dividing enemies, but like a simple line in the snow, one that could be stepped over with a single brave stride. Lucas crouched beside one of the candles and gently cupped his hands around it, shielding the flame from a gust of wind. His breath curled upward, warm and steady. "This," he murmured, though his English faltered, "this is how Christmas should feel." Thomas lowered himself to the snow beside him. "Aye," he said quietly. "Peaceful, human, even out here." The lanterns shimmered brighter for a moment, as if agreeing. The wind carried the warm scent of candle wax, faint but sweet, mixing with the crisp winter air. Soldiers huddled close to their small fires, exchanging murmured greetings, nods of respect, and gentle, uncertain smiles. In the glow of 100 tiny flames, the battlefield no longer felt like a place where war belonged, for tonight it belonged to peace. The lantern-lit field had warmed more than the air. It had warmed the men themselves, drawing them into small circles where laughter and gentle conversation drifted like soft music. The night, once sharp with cold and fear, now carried the comforting hum of human voices. Thomas walked with Lucas toward a gathering where British and German soldiers had begun laying out their meager rations atop blankets spread carefully across the snow. The blankets were worn, frayed at the edges, but they looked almost festive under the soft glow of lanterns. Men settled around them cross-legged, boots half buried in frost, shoulders nudged close for warmth. A British soldier gingerly placed a small tin of beef at the center. A German soldier added a loaf of dense rye bread. Another offered a handful of dried apples. A few packs of cigarettes were set down like prized offerings, alongside a precious square of chocolate wrapped in gold foil. The rations were pitiful by any feast's standards, yet here, tonight, they felt abundant. Thomas accepted a piece of the rye bread from Lucas, the crust firm and the inside surprisingly fragrant. He passed Lucas a bit of condensed milk tablet in return, watching the German's eyebrows lift in delight as he tasted the sweetness. "Sehr gut," Lucas said, nodding appreciatively. Very good." Thomas chuckled. "Aye, it's not much, but it's something." Nearby, a German officer and a British sergeant clinked tin cups in a quiet toast, their breath fogging between them. A soldier from the British side poured a splash of weak tea into a German's cup, and the German, in turn, shared a tiny portion of mulled wine he had saved for months. The mixture was warm, slightly tart, and carried the faint scent of cloves, an unexpected whisper of holiday warmth. Thomas held his cup close, letting the drink thaw his hands. He looked at Lucas, who drank from his own tin cup with a sigh of contentment. "Strange, isn't it?" Thomas said quietly. "Sharing a meal with the same men we were firing at yesterday." Lucas nodded, his expression thoughtful. "War makes enemies," he said slowly, searching for the right words. "But life makes us the same." Thomas sat with the words for a moment, letting them settle into him like warmth spreading through cold fingers. Another group of soldiers began passing around cigarettes, each man taking one and offering a nod of thanks. Even those who didn't smoke tucked the gift carefully into their coat pockets, a token of goodwill to keep, a memory to carry home one day. Beside them, a German soldier carefully unwrapped a paper bundle, revealing a few handmade ginger biscuits shaped like stars. Their edges were uneven, their surfaces slightly cracked, but the aroma of cinnamon and cloves drifted through the air like an unexpected hug. He broke one in half and handed it to a British soldier, who accepted it with the kind of gratitude usually reserved for miracles. Thomas tasted a piece of the fruitcake and let the sweetness linger on his tongue. It reminded him of home, of warm kitchens, the clatter of pans, the glow of candles in windows. It reminded him that even here, peace could taste real. Around them, men ate slowly, savoring every bite, not because the food was extraordinary, but because the moment was. In the heart of a frozen battlefield, they shared what little they had. And in doing so, they shared something greater than food. They shared humanity. The night, once still and solemn, gradually blossomed into something warmer, something alive. As the shared feast wound down, a quiet ripple of laughter drifted through the field, light and unexpected, like the flutter of wings across the snow. It began with a simple joke muttered by a British corporal about the state of army boots, and was met with a surprised chuckle from a German soldier who understood just enough English to catch the punchline. That single laugh broke open a gate. Soon, small pockets of humor began bubbling up across the field. British privates teased each other about snoring in the trenches. German soldiers mimicked the way their officers saluted during drills. Someone even tried to imitate a mule that used to haul supplies before bolting at the sound of artillery. The impression was so exaggerated, ears pinned back, hind legs kicking, that men on both sides burst into laughter, their voices warm clouds in the cold air. Thomas found himself smiling so widely his cheeks began to ache. It felt strange at first, this return of joy, like rediscovering an old scarf in the bottom of a trunk, soft and familiar. He stood with Lucas near a cluster of men who were attempting to tell jokes that crossed the language barrier. Most fell flat, tangled in translation, but somehow that only made them funnier. One German soldier tried to explain a joke about a farmer, a pig, and a broken wagon wheel, gesturing wildly with his arms. When no one understood, he slapped his hands against his knees in exaggerated despair, muttering, "Ach, nein, nein," which sent the British soldiers into peals of laughter. Another British private attempted a German phrase he'd overheard, but mispronounced it so badly that the German soldiers nearly doubled over. One clapped him on the back and tried to teach him the correct way, repeating the syllables slowly until the whole group chanted it together like a choir rehearsing. The wind carried their laughter upward. mingling with the glittering stars. For a moment, Thomas imagined the heavens bending closer, curious to witness this impossible joy unfolding between men who, only yesterday, hid from each other behind walls of earth. Lucas nudged Thomas with an elbow. "You laugh nicely," he said with a grin. Thomas shook his head, cheeks warming. "I don't get much chance these days." "Tonight," Lucas said, "and we all laugh more." More men gathered, drawn by the sound, like moths to warmth rather than flame. One British sergeant passed around a small book of riddles he'd been carrying since autumn, reading them aloud, while a German soldier translated them one line at a time. Each riddle earned groans of confusion or bursts of delighted understanding. A Scotsman with a booming voice recited a few lines of a folk tale, and though most of the Germans could not grasp the words, they applauded the musical cadence of his accent. Even the officers who had lingered at the fringes out of duty or caution found themselves smiling, perhaps unwillingly at first, but drawn in by the undeniable spirit of the night. Thomas felt the laughter wash through him like warm water, easing the knots he had carried for months. His shoulders relaxed. The world seemed softer. Around him, the soldiers weren't enemies. They weren't uniforms. They were young men, homesick men, good men, caught in something far beyond their choosing. And yet here they were, finding light in the cold, finding joy in the dark, finding each other. For the first time in a long while, the winter wind did not feel lonely as it swept across the field. It felt alive with human warmth and with the extraordinary sound of hope. As the laughter softened into a warm hum drifting across the frosted field, a new idea began to ripple through the gathered soldiers. It started with a German private who nudged a companion and pointed toward an abandoned leather football lying half buried in the snow, likely left from earlier supply deliveries. The ball, worn and scuffed, seemed almost out of place among the lanterns and footprints. The German soldier lifted it, brushing frost from its surface. Then, with a hopeful glance toward the British side, he raised it slightly and called out in accented English, "Football?" A murmur drifted through the British ranks. And even Sergeant Callum, who was known for his stern practicality, couldn't suppress a sigh of amusement. "Aye," he muttered, "but keep it friendly, lads." The German soldier gently placed the ball on the snow. A few men stepped forward, some British, some German, forming makeshift teams without discussion. No one dictated rules, no one argued over sides. It simply happened, as naturally as breathing. Thomas joined one of the groups, feeling a lightness in his limbs he hadn't felt in months. Lucas jogged up beside him, cheeks red with cold, breath rising in cheerful puffs. "You play?" Lucas asked. "Not well," Thomas admitted. "Heck, good," Lucas laughed. "I play terrible." They took their positions on the snowy field, which was uneven and pocked with craters from past shelling. The ball sat between them, a simple object that suddenly felt like treasure. A British private gave it a gentle kick, and the game began. It was not a match of skill, it was a match of joy. Boots slipped on ice, sending soldiers tumbling into soft snowbanks with shouts of laughter. A German forward sent the ball soaring far too high, prompting a British soldier to clap sarcastically and salute him with exaggerated flair. Even the officers watched with softened eyes, some exchanging quiet remarks that carried the tone of men who had forgotten, just for a moment, the weight of command. Thomas darted forward to intercept the ball, but stumbled on a hidden ridge of frozen earth. Lucas caught his arm, steadying him with a grin. "Careful. The ground fight's harder than soldiers." Thomas laughed breathlessly. "Aye, it does." The ball bounced unpredictably, skipping across frost-hardened snow and occasionally disappearing into powder before re-emerging with a triumphant wobble. Players from both sides shouted encouragement, sometimes in English, sometimes in German, sometimes in wordless sounds brimming with excitement. One British soldier managed an impressive kick that sent the ball rolling toward a makeshift goal marked by two rifles planted upright in the snow. But just as it neared the line, a German soldier dove dramatically, landing face first, but managing to deflect the ball with his boot. Cheers erupted from both sides, because no one here cared who won. The joy was in the playing. At one point, Lucas attempted a daring pass that went so wildly off course it nearly struck an officer observing from afar. The officer blinked in surprise, but instead of reprimanding him, simply raised an eyebrow and offered a slow, disbelieving shake of his head. The men roared with laughter. The match went on and on, breaths puffing like steam engines, boots churning through snow, shoulders brushing without hostility. Each slip, each tumble, each wild kick added to a growing sense that something extraordinary was happening, something bright enough to live forever in memory. For a few precious moments, the war faded. There were no trenches, no barbed wire, no nations divided, just men moving together under a silent winter sky, chasing a ball across a field that had briefly forgotten how to be a battlefield. And when the laughter rose again, full and bright, it echoed across the snow, like a promise the world would remember. The makeshift football match gradually slowed as exhaustion pressed gently on the soldiers' limbs. Breathless laughter faded into soft smiles, and the players drifted back toward the lantern-lit clusters forming once again across the snow. The sky above them had begun its subtle shift, still dark, still quiet, yet carrying the faintest hint of the coming dawn, a silver thread stretching along the horizon. Thomas and Lucas walked side by side, their boots sinking slightly into the cold earth. Both were flushed from exertion, cheeks tinged pink by the icy air. Thomas rubbed at his gloved hands, warming them as best he could, while Lucas adjusted the scarf tucked beneath his coat collar. They found a small rise in the ground and settled there, looking out over the field where soldiers now rested in relaxed groups. Some sat sharing the last remnants of their rations. Others leaned back to watch the faint stars lingering above. The lanterns still glowed softly, though their flames had grown lower, swaying in the breeze like tired dancers. Thomas exhaled deeply. "Strange night," he murmured. Lucas nodded, pulling his knees closer. "A good strange," he said quietly. Needed strange." For a while they simply sat, letting the peace settle between them like a warm blanket. No words were necessary. The silence felt gentle, thoughtful, a far cry from the oppressive quiet that usually accompanied the trenches. After a moment, Thomas spoke again. "Do you ever think about after all this?" His words came out hesitantly, fragile as frost on glass. Lucas tilted his head. "After the war?" "Aye." Lucas considered the question, his breath rolling slowly into the cold air. "Sometimes," he admitted, "sometimes I imagine going back to my village, painting again. I used to paint landscapes, forests, rivers, colors." He chuckled softly. "There is no color here." Thomas smiled faintly. "What would you paint of tonight?" Lucas looked out across the scene, the lanterns scattered like fallen stars, the men sitting in calm clusters, the frost shimmering beneath moonlight. "This," he said softly, I would paint this piece because it is real, even if it is only for one night. Thomas nodded, touched by the simplicity of the sentiment. I'd like to see that painting someday. Maybe, Lucas said with a small smile. One day you will. Their conversation drifted gently, ebbing and flowing like the tide. They spoke of home, Thomas describing the rolling green hills behind his village and the way the morning fog would cling to the valleys. Lucas shared stories of summer festivals, bright streamers flapping against blue sky, and the scent of warm bread wafting from his mother's kitchen window. With each exchanged memory, the distance between them shrank. Not just the physical space of the battlefield, but the unseen distance created by uniform, flag, and command. Nearby, Thomas could hear a British soldier softly plucking the strings of a violin, a simple melody drifting into the air like a fragile ribbon. A German soldier hummed along, matching the tune with gentle harmony. Their voices blended seamlessly with the falling quiet of the night. Lucas looked up at the sky. Dawn comes soon, he murmured. It will be over, this miracle. Thomas followed his gaze, noticing the faint rose hue blooming in the east. The thought tightened something in his chest. Aye, he said softly, but we still have this moment. Lucas nodded, his expression tender. Yes, and we will remember. The wind brushed gently across the snow, carrying their words into the softening dark. Lanterns flickered around them, their glow shifting with each breath of the breeze. For now, for this fleeting time, the world was still. And in that stillness, two soldiers, once enemies, now something closer to friends, shared the quiet truth that peace, however fragile, had found them. As the horizon brightened with the earliest blush of dawn, a soft ripple of movement stirred across the field. Soldiers who had been sitting in thoughtful silence slowly rose to their feet, brushing the frost from their coats. The lanterns, now dimming, flickered gently as though bowing to the coming light. At the center of the gathering, two figures stepped forward, one British, one German, each wearing the simple insignia of their faith, the chaplains. Their faces were lined with weariness, yet calm, carrying the quiet dignity of men who had spent long months stitching hope into broken spirits. The British chaplain, a tall man with silvering hair, raised his hand slightly. If you are willing, he said gently, let us offer a prayer together for peace, for our families, for the souls of those we've lost. His words drifted softly into the chilled morning air, carried by breath and stillness rather than authority. The German chaplain stepped beside him, nodding. Frieden, he said. Peace. A hush settled over the field, deep and profound. Soldiers from both sides drew nearer in a loose circle. Some bowed their heads. Others kept their eyes open, gazing at the horizon where daybreak slowly unfurled like the gentle opening of a flower. Thomas stood among them, Lucas at his side. He clasped his gloved hands together, feeling the rough wool beneath his palms, and let his gaze soften on the warm-hued sky. The British chaplain began first. Lord, on this cold and solemn morning, we thank you for the miracle of this night, for the courage of men who chose peace over fear, for the humanity that still breathes within us. His voice wavered slightly, not from age, but from emotion held tight over many hard months. The German chaplain continued, his accent soft, his tone reverent. Wir bitten für unsere Familien und für unsere Feinde, die keine Feinde mehr sind. We pray for our families and for our enemies who are no longer enemies. The words echoed gently across the assembly. Thomas felt a subtle ache in his chest, the beautiful, painful sort that comes from truth spoken aloud. Both chaplains bowed their heads. Silence followed, vast and tender. It was not the silence of the trenches, heavy, expectant, afraid. It was a silence of unity, a silence filled with shared breath, shared hope, shared heartache. Thomas closed his eyes. He thought of his sister waking early on Christmas morning, her footsteps dancing across the wooden floorboards. He thought of his mother lighting a candle in the sitting room. He thought of warmth, safety, and the promise of return. Beside him, Lucas whispered a few words too quiet to catch, but Thomas understood them anyway, not through language, but through the trembling softness of the moment. When the chaplains lifted their heads again, the first rays of sunlight kissed the snow, turning the battlefield into a landscape of gold and silver. The men blinked at the brightness, their breath shimmering in the new morning light. Then, softly, the British chaplain added, "May this peace stay in our hearts even when the world around us forgets it." The German chaplain nodded, his eyes glistening. Amen. A quiet chorus followed, spoken in many accents, yet carrying the same meaning. Amen. And in that small word, breathed into the dawn by men who had crossed the boundaries of war, something sacred lingered, like the faint resonance of a bell long after it has been struck. As the morning light strengthened, washing the field in a pale gold glow, the soldiers who had spent the night together found themselves reluctant to drift apart. The spell of the Christmas truce still clung to them, soft, fragile, warm, even as reality hovered at the edges of the dawn. Thomas and Lucas lingered near a cluster of men exchanging small tokens, buttons, badges, bits of ribbon tied from ration tins. But soon a new kind of exchange began, one far more personal. Names. A German soldier touched his cap respectfully to a British corporal and said, "Johann." The corporal smiled, offering his hand. "Edward?" Nearby, two Scotsmen were teaching a pair of young Germans how to pronounce their Gaelic names, laughing gently at the awkward attempts. A British private tried to roll his tongue properly around a German surname, failing spectacularly, but earning cheers for his persistence. Thomas turned to Lucas. "I never asked your full name," he said quietly. Lucas straightened slightly, brushing snow from his coat sleeve. "Lucas Adler," he replied, giving a small, almost bashful nod. "From Baden?" "Thomas Avery," Thomas said. "From Dorset." Lucas repeated the name softly, as though committing it to memory. "Thomas Avery," he said again with a small smile. "A good name?" Thomas felt a warmth unfurl in his chest, not from pride, but from the simple intimacy of being seen as himself, not as the enemy. "Lucas Adler," he echoed. "I'll remember that." All around them, similar threads of connection wove quietly through the cold morning air. Friedrich? Samuel? Peter? Carl? Henry? Names carried home across the front lines, spoken gently, respectfully, shared like gifts. Each one felt like a tiny act of defiance against hatred, against fear, against the pull of war. Lucas asked softly, "Do you have brothers, sisters?" "One sister," Thomas replied. "Catherine. She's 16, too clever for her own good." Lucas chuckled. "I have two younger brothers, always chasing each other, always loud." His eyes softened with memory. "I miss the noise." Thomas nodded. "I miss the quiet." They laughed softly together, their breath rising in white curls. Then Lucas reached into his coat and withdrew a small wooden carving, no larger than a thumb. It was a simple figure, a tiny bird perched on a branch. The wood was smoothed by careful hands, the wings etched with delicate lines. "For you," Lucas said, placing it in Thomas's palm. "I made it last month, to remind me of home, but I think you should have it." Thomas blinked, surprised. The carving was light, warm from Lucas's pocket. He ran his thumb over the tiny bird's wings, feeling the quiet life carved into it. "It's beautiful," he whispered. "Are you sure?" Lucas nodded. "Yes, maybe it brings you luck." Thomas exhaled, moved. "Thank you," he said softly. "Truly." After a moment's hesitation, he reached into his own coat and withdrew the photograph he had shown earlier. His family gathered by the fire. He had no duplicates, no copy to keep. But he felt deep in his bones that this gesture was right. He held it out. "For you," Thomas said. Lucas's eyes widened in surprise. "But this is your family." "Aye, and now they'll look after you too." Lucas took it gently, as though it were made of glass. He studied it with a tender, almost reverent expression. "Thank you, Thomas," he murmured. This means much." The morning air glowed around them, warming even the cold earth beneath their boots. Names had been exchanged, stories shared, tokens passed hand to hand. And in the quiet heart of a battlefield, two men, once strangers separated by wire and fear, felt the fragile but unbreakable thread of connection pull them together. As the sun crept a little higher, painting the snow in soft strokes of amber and rose, a sense of gentle purpose began to spread through the gathered soldiers. Someone, no one could later recall exactly who, pulled out a scrap of paper and a stub of pencil. He sat on a piece of overturned equipment, letting the thin light illuminate the page as he wrote carefully. That small act sparked something. Soon, soldiers across the field reached into their pockets and packs, withdrawing whatever they had, envelopes smudged by dirt, folded letters waiting for answers, blank scraps torn from old ration ledgers. The air filled with the rustle of paper and the quiet scratching of pencils, moving slowly, almost reverently, across the surface. It was as if the night's peace had loosened words that had long been trapped in their hearts. Thomas found a small sheet of paper tucked deep inside his coat, softened by months of travel, the edges frayed. He pulled out a short pencil he had been saving for weeks and sat beside Lucas on the gentle slope of a snowy ridge. Lucas was already writing, his brow furrowed slightly in concentration. The photograph Thomas had given him was tucked safely into his coat pocket, just visible beneath the wool. Thomas smiled faintly and lowered his gaze to his own paper. At first the words came slowly, haltingly, but then they began to flow, his pencil moving across the page in careful strokes. "Dear Mother, I am writing to you on Christmas morning, and something happened here, something I hardly know how to describe." He paused, taking in the sight around him. Men hunched over paper, some writing letters home, some writing poems, some simply drawing lines that traced the shape of their hopes. A Scottish soldier was sketching a German comrade beside him, both smiling shyly. A German officer wrote with elegant penmanship, stopping now and then to wipe away a tear he hoped no one noticed. A British sergeant muttered words under his breath as he searched for the right phrasing, his face soft with emotion. It felt like the battlefield itself had become a living journal, every breath, every heartbeat, every whispered memory etched invisibly into the cold air. Lucas glanced over at Thomas. "You write to your family?" "Aye," Thomas said softly, "telling them about all this." Lucas nodded. "Me too. They will not believe it." Thomas smiled. "Maybe one day people will talk about this night." They'll say it wasn't possible, that soldiers didn't meet in no man's land, didn't sing together, didn't shake hands. He lifted his eyes toward the horizon. But we'll know, won't we? Yes. Lucas's voice was warm, quiet. We will know. A gentle silence settled between them as they continued writing. Thomas's pencil moved steadily. I made a friend today, someone I never would have known if not for this war. His name is Lucas. He paused again, feeling a swell of emotion rise in his chest, strange and tender. He hadn't realized how deeply this moment had touched him until he saw the words forming on the page. Around them, a few soldiers compared letters, shyly reading lines aloud. Others sealed envelopes with melted candle wax, pressing them tight with cold fingers. Some wrote fragments of prayers or confessions they had carried for months. A German soldier nearby whispered into the quiet morning, "Vielleicht bringt das Schreiben Frieden." Perhaps writing brings peace. Thomas believed it did. When he finished, he folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his coat. The crisp edges lay warm against his chest, as though the letter itself carried a heartbeat. Beside him, Lucas closed his notebook and gave a small, contented sigh. "It is good," he said softly, "to put hope on paper." Thomas nodded. "Aye, helps it feel real." The two men sat for a moment longer, sharing the stillness. Around them, snowflakes began to drift gently from the pale sky, soft, unhurried, as if blessing the letters with quiet grace. It was a morning shaped by ink and breath, by fragile words written in the frost, by the simple human need to reach across distance, whether to loved ones far away or to the stranger sitting beside them. And in that shared act of remembering and hoping, the soldiers felt once more the unexpected warmth of peace. Snow continued to fall in gentle spirals as the soldiers tucked their finished letters into coat pockets, haversacks, or small tins meant to keep them dry. The morning light was brighter now, filtering through thin clouds and glinting softly off the frost-covered ground. It was a quiet radiance, humble, steady, like the calm breath after a long-held sigh. Thomas stood and stretched his stiff legs. Lucas rose as well, brushing snow from his knees. Both held their letters close, as though each envelope contained not just ink, but a fragile sliver of peace they hoped to carry back into the trenches. Across the field, men were exchanging addresses, some scrawled on scraps of paper, others spoken aloud and repeated until memorized. There was no telling whether such letters would ever be delivered or even allowed, but in this moment the possibility was enough. A British corporal showed a German soldier how to fold a letter tightly so it wouldn't get soaked. A German medic gave a British private an extra envelope, carefully smoothing it between gloved hands. These tiny acts, soft as falling snow, felt like bridges quietly being built. Lucas held out his letter to Thomas. "Do you want to read?" he asked gently. Thomas smiled, shaking his head. "It's for your family, not me." Lucas hesitated, then nodded. "Your family," he said thoughtfully, "will be happy to hear from you today." "Aye," Thomas murmured, looking down at the letter tucked into his own coat. "They will. And yours?" A distant, wistful expression touched Lucas's eyes. "I hope so." For a moment neither spoke. The wind carried a faint scent of burning wood from small fires still smoldering at the edges of the gathering. A few soldiers crouched beside them, warming their hands, watching the field with solemn curiosity, as though they, too, knew this moment could not last forever. A German lieutenant approached, his posture formal, but his expression softened by the morning's peace. He bowed his head slightly to the British soldiers nearby. "We're Dankanoy," he said. "We thank you." His English faltered, but he added carefully, "For this night." A British officer responded with equal sincerity, "And we thank you." They exchanged nods, simple, respectful, unadorned, and yet the weight of the gesture lingered like a warm hand on the shoulder. Thomas noticed that some soldiers were tying twine or bits of ribbon around their letters, marking them so they wouldn't be misplaced. Others slipped them between layers of clothing over their hearts. A few held them openly, gazing at them with quiet reverence. It struck him then how much these letters carried. Hopes whispered into the cold, love written with chilled fingers, truth captured during the one night the world had softened. Thomas pressed his hand against his coat, feeling the faint warmth of the folded paper beneath. He imagined his mother opening it, reading his words aloud by candlelight, her voice trembling, not from fear, but from relief. Lucas placed his hand over his own letter and said, almost to himself, "This will remind me that peace is possible." Thomas looked at him. "Aye," he said softly, "we need something to hold on to." A silence drifted between them, gentle, thoughtful, shaped by shared understanding. Then a gust of wind swept across the field, scattering snowflakes in swirling patterns. The lanterns flickered, their flames bending in the breeze. A few soldiers looked up, sensing the shift in the air. The night of peace had begun to thin. The morning of return approached. But for now, they stood in the calm between the two, letters in hands, hopes in hearts, holding tightly to the fragile miracle that had briefly stitched their divided world together. As the pale morning continued to unfold across the field, the soldiers slowly shifted their attention toward the familiar line of barbed wire marking the boundary between their worlds. It had always loomed as a silent, jagged reminder of the divide, cold metal curled into cruel shapes, meant to repel, to warn, to separate. But today, that cruel shape looked softer in the amber light. Thomas and Lucas walked together toward the wire, their boots crunching through a thin layer of fresh snow. More soldiers followed, forming a quiet procession across the field. Their steps were unhurried, reverent, as though approaching an altar rather than a battlefield barrier. When they reached the tangled line of metal, something remarkable happened. No one recoiled. No one stiffened. Instead, men from both sides reached toward it, not to pull it apart, not to cross it, but simply to touch it gently. A British private placed his gloved palm against a loop of frost-covered wire. A German soldier mirrored the gesture from the other side. Their fingertips didn't meet, but the intention did. The air around them felt charged with something tender, like the hush of a chapel before a prayer. Thomas stepped closer, examining the way ice had formed tiny crystalline flowers along the twisted metal. They sparkled in the morning sun, fragile and fleeting. "It looks different today," he murmured. Lucas nodded. "Less dangerous." "Aye," Thomas said quietly, "almost like it's sleeping." A few German soldiers began carefully placing small items into the gaps in the wire, tokens exchanged during the night. A button, a green sprig someone had saved from a ration parcel, a bit of cloth embroidered with initials. Others added cigarettes or scraps of ribbon. Each tiny offering hung like ornaments on a frost-touched tree. On the British side, men responded in kind. A Scottish soldier tied a bit of tartan cloth to a wire loop. A corporal wedged a piece of chocolate wrapper beside it, gold shimmering in the pale light. Some simply laid their hands upon the metal, sealing the moment with quiet presence. It was no longer a wall. It had become a memorial, a shared mark of humanity. Thomas removed one of his old brass uniform buttons, the metal scratched and worn from months of crawling through mud. He held it in his hand for a moment, feeling the warmth of his palm seep into it. Then he slipped it onto a curved point of wire. Lucas smiled softly. "A good place for it," he said. "You should add something too," Thomas replied. Lucas hesitated, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, smooth pebble, dark, rounded, the kind one might find near a quiet riverbank. He placed it carefully beside Thomas's button. "A stone from home," Lucas explained quietly, "from a river near my village." Thomas felt emotion swell in his chest, slow and full. "It belongs here," he said. A moment of stillness followed as the soldiers stepped back, admiring the strange, beautiful line of shared offerings. The barbed wire, once a symbol of division, now looked almost like a fragile necklace suspended between two nations, sparkling softly in the rising sun. One of the German chaplains murmured something in awe, his breath curling into the cold. "Dies ist heiliger Boden." "This is holy ground," a British sergeant whispered in return. "Aye, for once it truly is." The men stood together in a hushed semicircle, gazing at the wire adorned with pieces of their lives. Every object held a story. Every story added to the quiet warmth that had settled over the field. And though none of them said it aloud, they all felt the truth. This moment would not come again. This peace was fragile, but it was real, and it would live in them long after they returned to the trenches. As the sun lifted a little higher, brushing the snow with warm strokes of light, someone in the British ranks lifted a small, boxy camera, a rare possession, meant for capturing moments almost no one thought existed out here. A murmur spread gently through the crowd, curious and soft. "A camera," Lucas whispered with quiet wonder. "You can take pictures here?" Thomas smiled faintly. "If it still works in this cold." The soldier with the camera, an earnest young private with a woolen scarf wrapped awkwardly around his face, looked around, nervous but determined. "Thought maybe we ought to remember this," he said, "in case they don't believe us." A ripple of agreement drifted across the field. So the soldiers began to gather, not in rigid lines, not in the stiff formality of military portraits, but in a loose, warm cluster, men from both armies shoulder to shoulder, some standing, some crouching, all wearing expressions touched by the fragile miracle of the day. Thomas and Lucas moved closer to the center, standing side by side. Thomas pulled his coat tighter as a breeze swept across the frost, but the warmth of the moment held him steady. Lucas's shoulder brushed his lightly, grounding him in the quiet reality of their companionship. A British sergeant barked a gentle instruction. "Spread out a bit, lads. Let the light in." A German soldier joked, "Do not let the snow make us look too pale." The men chuckled, their laughter soft and warm. The private adjusted the camera, winding it carefully with stiff fingers. "Right then," he said. "Everybody hold still." The soldiers settled. The lanterns behind them flickered in the breeze. A few men leaned their heads together, sharing half-embarrassed smiles. One placed a hand lightly on the shoulder of a soldier from the other side, a gesture of camaraderie that would have been unimaginable the day before. Thomas felt Lucas glance his way. He turned just slightly, enough to meet his friend's eyes. Lucas's smile was small but bright, honest, the kind that rose from somewhere deep inside. Thomas felt something warm and aching settle behind his ribs. He nodded gently, the unspoken message clear. I'll remember this. I'll remember you. The private swallowed once, bracing himself against the cold. On three, he called. One. A hush fell. Two. Breath suspended in the air. Three. The camera clicked, a single sharp sound that echoed across the silent field like the soft toll of a bell. In that instant, the moment was captured. Enemies standing as brothers. A battlefield transformed into a place of peace. One dawn in the midst of a terrible war, held still forever. The private lowered the camera with a trembling sigh. Got it, he whispered. I think it worked. A few soldiers cheered softly, careful not to break the gentle atmosphere. Others clapped the photographer on the back, thanking him. A German officer bowed his head respectfully toward the British group, his voice low. Danke, he said. This is important. Thomas turned to Lucas. A picture like that, it'll mean more than any letter, Lucas nodded. It will show the truth, that we were human here. A breeze stirred the snow at their feet, sending tiny crystals dancing around them like glitter caught in sunlight. The world felt still, fragile and luminous, its harsh edges softened by human warmth and the quiet memory newly carved into time. For the rest of their lives, none of them would forget what the camera had captured, and none of them would forget the feeling of standing together, if only for a moment, as men, not enemies. As the last echoes of the camera shutter faded into the crisp morning air, a gentle stillness settled again across the field. The sun now sat just above the horizon, soft and pale, casting long shadows behind the soldiers. And then, almost as if summoned by the quiet itself, a violin began to play. The notes rose delicately, trembling through the cold, carrying a tenderness that touched every ear. It was the same British soldier who had played the night before, drawing his bow across the strings with slow, loving care. The melody was simple, wistful, shaped like a sigh that lingered in the heart long after it left the lips. The German soldiers recognized it first, a folk tune, peaceful and old, a song of longing, of home. Lucas inhaled softly. My grandmother used to hum this, he whispered. Thomas felt the music settle into him, warm as candlelight. Aye, he murmured. Feels like something I've always known. The violinist's breath formed small ghosts of vapor each time he exhaled, but his hands moved steadily despite the cold. The bow glided across the strings, coaxing sound that shimmered like ice turning to water. A German soldier, standing near the center of the crowd, closed his eyes and began to hum along, soft at first, then with growing confidence. Another joined him, then another. Their voices blended tenderly with the violin, forming a gentle chorus that wrapped around the field like a warm scarf. Soon British soldiers added their harmony, quiet, hesitant, but deeply heartfelt. The two sides did not sing in perfect unison. Their accents differed, their timing wavered, but the imperfections only made the moment more human, more beautiful. Lucas's voice joined the rising hum, soft and steady. Thomas listened for a moment, feeling the resonance of the music inside his chest, and then he, too, added his voice. A low note at first, barely a whisper, then fuller, warmer, carried by breath and hope. The melody drifted upward into the brightening sky, curling around the lanterns, weaving through the cold morning air, touching every man who stood on that sacred stretch of snow. For a few minutes, the battlefield belonged entirely to music. No commands, no fear, no division, just voices, fragile but earnest, singing the same song beneath the same sky. When the tune softened and finally came to rest, a long silence followed, but it was not empty. It was full, overflowing with gratitude, ache, and the quiet understanding that nothing this precious could last forever. The violinist lowered his bow. His glove brushed the strings gently as though bidding them rest. The gathered soldiers exhaled as one, a single breath shared across the field. Lucas turned to Thomas, his eyes shining with a soft, uncertain sorrow. "Soon," he whispered, "we must go back." Thomas swallowed his throat tight. "Aye," he murmured, "but not yet, not quite yet." The music still lingered in the air, faint as a memory not ready to fade. It curled around them like the last warm ember of a dying fire. For this moment, this one brief miracle, they stood together, held by a song that reached across everything that divided them. And though morning marched steadily forward, the peace the music had given them remained, glowing quietly in their hearts. The final notes of the violin drifted into the warming air, leaving behind a silence so gentle that even the breeze seemed hesitant to disturb it. The soldiers stood together quietly, some with eyes lowered, others gazing at the brightening sky as if trying to hold the moment in place. Then slowly, life moved again. A British private reached into his coat and pulled out a small, weathered packet of cigarettes, nearly empty, saved for moments when the cold bit too hard or fear pressed too close. He held it out toward a nearby German soldier, offering with a faint, earnest smile. The German man blinked with surprise, then grinned, accepting the cigarette with gratitude. He tapped it lightly against his gloved hand before placing it between his lips. Thomas and Lucas drifted toward them, and soon another cigarette was offered to Thomas. He accepted, then held the packet out toward Lucas. "For you," he said. Lucas hesitated, only a breath's worth, then took the cigarette and rolled it between his fingers thoughtfully. "A peace offering," he said softly. "Aye," Thomas replied, "and a memory." A small group formed, a circle of British and German soldiers standing quietly in the middle of the field. Someone lit a match, the flame trembling in the wind. The first soldier leaned in, protecting the spark with cupped hands, inhaling until the tip of his cigarette glowed softly. Then he passed the tiny flame around the group, each man leaning toward it, each face briefly lit by the warm orange glow. When Lucas finally bent toward the flickering flame, Thomas watched him carefully, noticing the way the light illuminated the softened lines of his expression, the gentleness, the calm. Lucas inhaled gently, then exhaled a thin trail of smoke that curled upward into the cold air. Thomas did the same, letting the warmth settle in his chest. They stood side by side, sharing an unspoken stillness. A German soldier broke the silence first, speaking quietly to the group. "Das ist ein guter Morgen," he said. "This is a good morning." A British soldier nodded. "Aye, one to remember." The cigarette tips glowed softly in the spreading light, tiny embers burning bright against the snow. The men smoked slowly, savoring the moment more than the tobacco. It wasn't the cigarette that mattered. It was the act of sharing it, a small ritual of camaraderie, binding them together for just a little longer. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, inhaling the crisp scent of smoke mingled with the cold. It reminded him of evenings by the hearth at home, when his father would sit beside the fire and puff quietly on a pipe, as stories stretched long into the night. Lucas must have felt something similar, because he spoke in a voice thick with memory. "My father smokes like this," he said. "He says it helps him think." Thomas chuckled softly. "Mine smokes when he's trying not to think." Their laughter, quiet, warm, floated gently into the air. But as their cigarettes burned lower, a subtle heaviness crept back into the moment. Not despair, nothing so sudden or sharp. Rather a slow settling awareness that the day was moving forward and time was no longer theirs to shape. A British corporal glanced toward the trenches, where shadows already hinted at officers preparing to reestablish order. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Won't be long now," he murmured. A German soldier echoed the sentiment in his own tongue. "Essendet bald." It ends soon. The group fell silent again, each man holding his cigarette like a slender fragment of the night's peace, burning down to ash. Thomas met Lucas's gaze. Both men understood. The truce was nearing its inevitable close. But not yet. Not until the last ember faded. Lucas flicked the final bit of ash from his cigarette and whispered, "Thank you for this time." Thomas swallowed. "Thank you, Lucas, for everything." The breeze carried away the last traces of smoke, leaving their breaths to rise alone into the cold morning air. And though the world around them slowly began to shift back toward the hard rhythm of war, the softness of the moment lingered, held by the simple act of standing together, sharing warmth, sharing breath, sharing peace. As the soldiers lingered in the soft afterglow of peace, the distant thud of boots crunching through snow signaled a change in the air. Officers from both sides were making their way back toward the field, some slowly, some briskly, carrying themselves with the weight of duty that had briefly loosened in the night's miracle. Thomas noticed them first, silhouettes emerging from the pale light, shoulders squared, expressions taut beneath their caps. Their footsteps broke the fragile hush, not harshly, but with an inevitability that made the soldiers straighten instinctively. Lucas exhaled beside him, a soft sigh that clouded into the cold. "It begins again," he murmured. Thomas nodded. "Aye, but let's hold on to the last minutes." The officers approached the mingling groups of soldiers, their brows furrowed, in a mix of bewilderment, restraint, and something almost like reluctance. They had expected chaos, or fraternization they must quickly quash, but instead they found men standing calmly, respectfully, in gentle circles. No one hiding, no one ashamed. Only a quiet unity, as fragile as frost. A British captain cleared his throat, not unkindly. "All right, lads, gather your things." His voice wavered just slightly, betraying an emotion he tried to swallow. "We'll need to head back soon." A German lieutenant echoed the message on his side, though his tone was similarly softened. "Eiserich, back to positions." But neither side moved immediately. The officers paused, uncertain. Perhaps it was the sight of the decorated barbed wire, perhaps the lanterns still flickering in the snow, perhaps the mingled footprints crossing what had once been a forbidden stretch of ground. Whatever it was, something held them still. A British major stepped forward, scanning the field with a slow sweep of his gaze. "Remarkable," he whispered under his breath. "Truly remarkable." A German Hauptmann beside him nodded solemnly, his eyes shining faintly. "Ein Wunder," he replied. "A miracle." Gradually the officers began to confer among themselves in subdued tones, not barking orders, not scolding, but speaking in low, thoughtful voices. They knew the war demanded structure, demanded distance, demanded the return of the line that had dissolved so completely overnight. But they also knew they had walked into history. Thomas watched their faces carefully. Beneath their stern exteriors he saw exhaustion. He saw longing. He saw men who, like those they commanded, carried families, memories, and hopes, tucked away under layers of wool and discipline. One British lieutenant approached Thomas's group, stopping beside the decorated wire. He touched a small ribbon tied there, tartan, shimmering faintly in the light, and sighed deeply. "Never seen anything like this," he said softly. "Not in my life." A German officer standing nearby responded with halting English. "Please, remember this day, even when fighting continues." The lieutenant nodded. "I will." Lucas, quiet until now, looked toward Thomas. "They do not want to end it either," he said softly. "No," Thomas agreed. "But the war." "The war doesn't ask what we want." The officers made one final set of announcements, this time with gentler wording, as if trying not to shatter the fragile beauty still lingering in the air. "Begin making your way back. Prepare to return to the trenches. Do it slowly. Do it respectfully." Soldiers exchanged glances, not fearful, but sorrowful. The moment was slipping away. The morning was calling them back to their separate worlds. Thomas inhaled deeply, memorizing the sight one last time, the mingled uniforms, the shared smiles, the softened snow beneath countless footprints. Lucas, standing beside him, eyes cast slightly downward, the photograph of Thomas's family tucked safely into his coat. "Aye," Thomas whispered, "we'd best head back soon." Lucas nodded, but neither of them moved. Not yet. Not for these last few seconds that still belonged to peace. The officers' voices faded gently into the cold air as the soldiers slowly prepared themselves to part. There was no rush, not yet. Instead, a quiet understanding passed through the gathered men. Before they returned to their trenches, before the world snapped back into its rigid lines, they would share one last moment, one last gesture, one last connection, one last farewell. Thomas turned to Lucas, the weight of the morning settling softly over his heart. The golden light illuminated Lucas's face, glinting in the corners of his eyes. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the kind of look shared not between enemies, but between two souls changed by something rare. Lucas extended his hand first. Thomas took it without hesitation. Their gloves brushed, rough wool against rough wool, but the warmth that passed between their palms was unmistakable. A warmth born of shared laughter, shared fear, shared hope, of a night and morning they both knew would stay with them long after the war returned to its unforgiving rhythm. "I will not forget this," Lucas said softly, his voice steady, but colored with sorrow. "Aye," Thomas replied, "nor will I." Their hands lingered together a heartbeat longer than necessary, holding tightly to the fleeting moment before gently releasing. All around them, similar exchanges were unfolding. A British corporal clasped the shoulder of a German medic. Two Scotsmen embraced a pair of young German privates, laughing softly even as their eyes shone with emotion. A German officer bowed his head respectfully to a group of British soldiers, offering a final handshake to each man. A British sergeant murmured, "Take care of yourselves," receiving nods and quiet blessings in return. Some shook hands firmly, some clasped forearms in the grip of comrades. Some simply touched gloved fingers to gloved fingers, offering a gesture too small for war, but perfect for peace. Thomas watched as one British private exchanged cap badges with a German soldier, each fastening the other's emblem to their coats. Another pair swapped scarves, tugging the fabric snug around the other's neck with tender, almost familial care. The air filled with soft goodbyes spoken in two languages, some translated awkwardly, some understood without words at all. Auf Wiedersehen, good luck, mate. Bleib sicher, stay safe. Till we meet again. The snow beneath their feet bore a tapestry of footprints, British, German, mingled and intertwined, as though the earth itself wished to remember their unity. Lucas lifted one hand in a small farewell gesture, his expression gentle. Thomas returned it, feeling the ache of finality settle deep in his chest. "You will write?" Lucas asked quietly. Thomas nodded. "Aye. If letters can find their way across all this, I'll write." Lucas smiled, soft and hopeful. "Then I will write too." Another silence stretched between them, warm and fragile. Then Lucas stepped back, the first small shift toward parting. Thomas felt the world pull at him too, subtle, inevitable, like the tide rising at the edge of a quiet shore. Around them, the soldiers began to drift toward their trenches, each step slow and reluctant. Some turned back for one last look. Some paused, unable to move yet. Some bowed their heads, gathering themselves for what awaited them. Thomas and Lucas took one final step away from each other, though neither wanted to be the first to turn. "Goodbye, Thomas," Lucas said softly. "Goodbye, Lucas," Thomas whispered. The morning air held their words gently, tucking them into the stillness like small treasures. It was the last moment before the world reclaimed them, the last breath of peace, the last handshake in the snow. The field that had moments ago been alive with connection and warmth now lay quiet, touched by the soft hush of parting footsteps. Soldiers from both sides began their slow return toward the trenches, moving not in formation but in small, thoughtful clusters, some silent, some exchanging lingering words, all carrying the fragile weight of what they had just experienced. Thomas walked a few paces behind a group of British soldiers, his boots sinking into the snow where countless footprints overlapped. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from exhaustion, but from the ache of leaving something extraordinary behind. He looked over his shoulder. Lucas was walking in the opposite direction, heading toward the German line. His coat fluttered slightly in the cold wind, and the morning light cast a soft glow on the snow around him. For a brief moment, Lucas turned as well. Their eyes met across the widening distance. A silent farewell passed between them, gentle, steady, full of unspoken gratitude. Then Lucas lifted one hand in a small wave. Thomas returned it, his heart tightening. The distance grew. Around Thomas, the British soldiers walked slowly, as though hoping the ground might delay its inevitable return to routine. One private muttered under his breath, "Feels wrong, don't it? Going back like it never happened." Another nodded. "Wish we could freeze time, just for a bit longer." Their voices were soft, held carefully like fragile things. The decorated barbed wire faded behind them, its small tokens glinting faintly in the morning sun, buttons, ribbons, scraps of hope fluttering gently in the cold air. Thomas could almost imagine the wire whispering to them, "Remember." Snowflakes drifted downward again, small and delicate, settling on shoulders and caps. The world felt quiet, almost reverent, as though even the sky mourned the ending of the miraculous night. When Thomas neared the lip of the British trench, he slowed. The wooden planks leading down looked darker than he remembered, the trench walls colder, more confined. After hours in the open air surrounded by warmth and connection, the trench felt like a narrow doorway back into a world he no longer fully recognized. Sergeant Callum stood at the entrance, hands tucked beneath his arms for warmth. His face was lined with thought, his expression far gentler than usual. As Thomas approached, Callum gave a faint nod. "A hell of a thing that was," he murmured. Thomas swallowed, nodding. "Aye, Sergeant. I'll never forget it." Callum exhaled, white mist curling from his lips. "See that you don't. Nights like that, they don't come often in a lifetime." Thomas stepped down into the trench, the soft crunch of snow replaced by the muffled thud of boots on damp boards. The air was colder here, darker. The sounds of the field above faded gradually, footsteps receding, voices softening, the quiet mingling of two armies dissolving into memory. Other soldiers climbed down behind him, each carrying the same strange look, part sorrow, part wonder, part disbelief that such a night could have unfolded at all. One man touched a small keepsake tucked into his pocket. Another wiped at his eyes quickly, hoping no one noticed. Thomas paused halfway down, steadying himself against the trench wall. He felt the letter over his heart, the folded paper warm from his body heat. In his other pocket, the small wooden bird Lucas had carved lay safely tucked away. Two reminders, two anchors to a moment of humanity. He stepped off the last rung of the ladder, boots now firmly on trench ground. A distant call rose from the German side. He couldn't make out the words, but he knew their meaning. The miracle was ending. But it was not gone. As Thomas took a deep breath and let the dim morning settle around him, he whispered softly to himself, "Let me carry it. Let me remember." And then, with the gentle ache of peace still lingering in his chest, he continued down the trench, returning to the world that waited, but forever changed by the one night that dared to be different. The trench felt different when Thomas reached the bottom, narrower somehow, darker, as though the earthen walls had crept closer during the night. The familiar smell of damp wood and cold mud rushed up to meet him, but it no longer felt like part of him, not after everything he had just seen above. He paused, letting his eyes adjust to the dimmer light. The soft glow of morning filtered weakly over the trench lip, barely brushing the tops of helmets as British soldiers shuffled back to their positions. Their breaths came in quiet puffs, and their movements, usually sharp and hurried, now seemed almost reverent. No clatter, no shouting, no tension. Just a settling hush, like the last lingering echo of a hymn. Thomas leaned his back against the trench wall and closed his eyes for a moment. He could still hear the violin, still feel the warmth of shared laughter drifting like a distant ember through his memory, still see the flicker of lanterns glowing across a field where fear had softened into something fragile and beautiful. Sergeant Callum stepped beside him, rubbing his gloved hands together for warmth. "Feels wrong, doesn't it?" he said quietly. "Feels too quiet down here now." Thomas opened his eyes and nodded. "Aye." Like the world above was bigger than this. Callum looked at him, studying his expression. "That's because it was." He lowered his voice. "Don't let the trench shrink it. Hold on to what happened." Thomas felt the wooden bird in his pocket, its small carved wings warm against his leg. "I will, Sergeant." Callum nodded, satisfied, before moving on to check on the others. Across the trench, soldiers settled onto crates and benches, their movements slow, thoughtful. No one complained about the cold. No one muttered curses at the mud. Even the usual banter felt muted. They were holding something inside, something too delicate to speak of loudly. A young private sat opposite Thomas, staring up at the pale sky with wonder still glowing in his eyes. "I talked to a German lad," he murmured to no one in particular. "Said he had a baby born last month. Can you imagine? He's got a baby, and he's out here." Another soldier beside him added softly, "They're not so different from us, are they?" "No," the private said, shaking his head slowly. "Not at all." A silence followed, gentle, contemplative. Then a faint sound drifted across the still air like a ghost of the night before. It took Thomas a moment to realize what it was. Voices, German voices, not shouting, not commanding, just talking, calmly, almost peacefully. The British soldiers looked up, listening. For one more breath, for one more heartbeat. The peace held. Thomas swallowed, letting the sound settle into him. It was strange, comforting even, to hear the familiar murmur of enemy soldiers without fear attached to it. It reminded him of how human they were, of how human everyone was. Then, gradually, the German voices faded back into distance. The trench grew still again. One British soldier whispered, It's like the world's holding its breath." Thomas agreed. Only hours ago the night had been filled with songs, handshakes, laughter, warmth. Now the quiet felt heavier, but not cold, not empty. It was a silence shaped by remembrance, by connection, by the gentle ache of knowing something rare had just slipped through their fingers. He finally sat on an old crate, letting the stillness wash over him. Snowflakes drifted past the trench lip, spiraling softly down into the narrow walkway below. They melted on his sleeves, disappearing almost as soon as they landed, like the truce itself. Fragile, short-lived, but real. Thomas closed his eyes again, and this time he whispered something only the cold air could hear. "Thank you." Whether he meant the night, the songs, the laughter, Lucas, or all of it together. Even he wasn't sure. He just knew this silence, this strange, tender quiet, was the space left behind when peace has touched a place and moved on, leaving the world immeasurably changed. The stillness of the trench lingered like a fragile veil, delicate and trembling, but slowly, almost reluctantly, the machinery of war began to stir again. It started as a distant rumble, the muted sound of officers clearing their throats, shuffling papers, and speaking in tones that hinted at the return of structure, of duty, of the sharp line that divided one side from the other. Thomas watched as a British lieutenant stepped forward onto a firing platform, his breath curling into the cold air. He held a clipboard in one gloved hand, the paper stiff with frost. His posture was straighter than it had been minutes before, more rigid, more aligned with the demands of his rank. But his eyes still carried the residue of the morning's peace. "All right, lads," the lieutenant began, voice low but steady. "We've received word from command." A hush fell across the trench. Soldiers who had been lingering in quiet thought now turned their heads toward him, their faces pale in the soft morning light. "The truce is officially over." The words settled like a slow snowfall, gentle, but heavy enough to change everything. No one spoke. No one cursed. No one even shifted. The lieutenant swallowed before continuing. "You are to resume standard duties, cleaning your rifles, rotating watch, no further communication with the enemy." He paused, letting the final line sink in. "Letters will be collected shortly. Prepare them for dispatch." A few soldiers lowered their gazes, clutching their pockets where their letters lay warm from their bodies. Others stared straight ahead, expressionless, as though trying to accept the reality without breaking something inside themselves. Thomas felt his heart sink, though the announcement was no surprise. He had known this would come, they all had. Peace, no matter how miraculous, cannot hold back the tide of war on its own. Still, Hearing it aloud felt like watching a delicate glass ornament slip from someone's fingers and shatter on the floor. The lieutenant stepped down, rubbing at his forehead with a tired hand. Before walking away, he added quietly, so softly only the closest soldiers heard, "For what it's worth, I wish it could have lasted." One private beside Thomas whispered, "Aye, we all do." The trench creaked softly under shifting boots as men reluctantly rose to begin their duties. Some picked up their rifles with hands that moved slower than usual, as though touching something that no longer felt entirely theirs. Others began brushing snow from equipment, the motions mechanical, dulled. Thomas reached for his rifle, where it leaned against the trench wall. His fingers hovered above the cold metal, hesitant. The weapon felt foreign to him now, jarringly out of place in hands that had only hours earlier shaken those of German soldiers in warmth and trust. Lucas's carved wooden bird pressed gently against Thomas's leg inside his coat, a tiny reminder of everything the night had given him. Slowly, with a quiet exhale, he lifted the rifle. It was heavier than he remembered. A few men muttered under their breath as they inspected their weapons. "Doesn't feel right," one said. "Not after all that." "No," another agreed. "Feels like waking from a dream too soon." Sergeant Callum walked by, placing a firm, encouraging hand on Thomas's shoulder. "We do our duty, lad," he said softly. "But we don't have to forget. No rule says we can't carry the memory." Thomas nodded, grateful for the words. The morning continued to brighten, its soft colors almost mocking the return of routine. Snowflakes drifted lazily into the trench, settling on barrels, boots, and letters, waiting to be collected. Men resumed their tasks, but none of them carried the same hardness in their faces they'd worn the day before. Something had changed. Something had softened. And though command had ended the truce, the night's peace still glowed quietly in the hearts of all who'd lived it. Thomas tucked his rifle against his shoulder, but his thoughts were far beyond the trench, on the field, on the songs, on the shared laughter, and most of all, on Lucas, walking back across the snow with a photograph tucked close to his heart. War had returned, but so had something deeper, something the orders could not erase. With rifles cleaned and duties reluctantly resumed, the trench slowly settled back into its familiar rhythm, though the rhythm felt out of tune, stumbling and soft, as if unsure how to move forward after such an extraordinary pause. Thomas took his position near a firing step, though he did not raise his weapon. No one did. Not yet. The officers had given the order to resume routine, not hostility, and for the moment, that gave the soldiers a precious sliver of time to adjust their hearts back into the hard shape the war demanded. He rested his gloved hands on the cold lip of the trench and lifted his gaze toward the German line. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air, melting on the rough boards beneath him. The world seemed quieter up here, as though holding on to the last breaths of the truce. Then, movement. A figure emerged from the German trench, not climbing out, but simply standing at the top, visible above the lip. Thomas's breath caught. Lucas. He wasn't waving, wasn't signaling, just standing there for a moment in the morning light, looking across the field as if searching for something familiar. His posture was relaxed, yet resolute, shoulders lifted with a soft inhale, as though he too carried the weight of returning to separate worlds. Thomas felt warmth thrum through him, gentle, steady, unexpected. Without fully realizing he was doing it, Thomas raised one hand slightly above the trench edge. Not a full wave, just a small gesture, a quiet acknowledgement. A final thread held across the divide. Lucas saw him. Their eyes met across the space that had once been no man's land, but had, for a night and morning, become shared ground. Lucas's lips curved into a small, tender smile, faint but unmistakably real. He touched 2 fingers to his coat pocket, where Thomas's family photograph rested. Then he pressed those fingers gently over his heart. Thomas felt his throat tighten. In response, he touched his own pocket, where Lucas's carved bird lay safe, and nodded slowly. No words were spoken. None were needed. Across the field, another German soldier stepped up beside Lucas. He looked out toward the British line, then down at Lucas, then back again. For a moment, Thomas feared the man might scold him or call an officer, but instead the German soldier gave a quiet nod of understanding and rested a hand briefly on Lucas's shoulder before stepping away. Thomas let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Lucas lingered for a few seconds longer, just long enough for the moment to etch itself into the morning air, before he stepped back down into the trench and disappeared from view. The distance between them felt heavier now that he was gone, but it also felt connected, as though an invisible bridge stretched gently across the field, anchored by memory and humanity. Beside Thomas, a British private leaned forward, peering across the snow. "You know him, then?" he asked quietly. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. I do." The private smiled softly. "Good sort, from the look of him." "Aye," Thomas said again, his voice warm. "He is." Another soldier nearby murmured, almost to himself, "Strange thing, seeing the faces of the men we've been told to fear." "Not so strange," Thomas replied softly. "Not now." The British line, though back in its defensive posture, felt gentler, less rigid. Some soldiers noticed familiar shapes or colors among the German coats and helmets, the subtle recognition of faces they had laughed with only hours before. One man whispered, "I shared a biscuit with that one." Another said, "He helped light me cigarette." Another still murmured, "That lad told me about his farm." Judgment had shifted, perspective softened. The field between them was empty again, but no longer hostile. It felt like a held breath, quiet, suspended. Thomas looked once more at the place where Lucas had stood. Snow drifted down gently, erasing footprints, smoothing the field, but nothing could erase the memory of the young man's quiet smile in the morning light. A glimpse across the lines, a reminder of what peace could look like. And though the war loomed ahead, Thomas felt something steady inside him, something that would guide him through whatever came next, a connection, a memory, a promise held silently across a snowy field. The calm of the morning carried on longer than anyone expected. Soldiers worked quietly, speaking in hushed tones, their movements gentle, careful, almost as though they feared that any sudden noise might shatter the lingering peace still wrapped around the trenches like a fragile veil of frost. But peace, as the soldiers knew too well, was a guest easily frightened. Thomas was wiping down the bolt of his rifle when the first sign of change arrived. Not a sound, but a feeling, a subtle tightening in the air, a shift in the wind, a tension returning like a shadow stretching across the snow. Around him, other soldiers paused, heads lifting, some glancing toward the officers as if they too sensed the shift. Then it came, a single distant boom, faint, far off, but unmistakably artillery. The men froze. The noise rolled across the battlefield like a reminder, a low thunder that said the world beyond this miraculous stretch of land had not changed, no matter how deeply the night had touched them. Another boom followed, closer this time. The trench seemed to contract around Thomas, the wooden walls pressing in with memories of fear and duty. His heart tightened, not with the panic he had felt so many times before, but with sorrow. "Here it comes," murmured a private beside him, eyes lowering. But the guns did not immediately fire on their sector. Instead, the distant rumbling continued, echoing through the morning air like a slow approaching storm. It was as if the war itself were waking, groggy, but inevitable. Sergeant Callum stepped forward, voice low but steady. "Stay sharp, lads. Back to stations. Keep your heads down." No one protested. No one complained. They simply obeyed, quietly, reluctantly, because they understood. Duty had returned. Thomas lifted his rifle again. The metal, still cold from the night air, felt heavier than earlier. His fingers curled around it, but without the hardened instinct that once guided him. It felt like holding a weight he no longer believed in. A British officer walked along the trench, issuing orders in a subdued voice, orders that felt smaller after the night they had lived through. "Prepare for possible engagement. Watch the line. No firing unless directed." The last line hung in the air like a thin thread of hope. Across the field, Thomas saw faint movement in the German trench, helmets rising, shapes adjusting positions. They too were preparing, though he sensed the same reluctance in their posture, the same heaviness. Then, unexpectedly, a German soldier raised a small white cloth above the trench lip, not waving it wildly, not signaling surrender, just holding it for a brief moment, letting it flutter gently in the cold air before lowering it again. A final goodbye, a final acknowledgement, a final wish for peace. No officer barked at him, no one shot. The cloth fell back into the trench like a fading breath. Thomas felt a sting behind his eyes. Another boom echoed in the distance. The war was coming closer, tightening its grip once more. But the truce had left something behind, something even artillery could not fully drown. Memories of singing, of laughter, of shared warmth, of Lucas standing with a hand over his heart. A private near Thomas whispered, "Feels wrong to fight after all that." Another replied softly, "Aye, but the war doesn't ask us what feels right." Thomas kept his gaze fixed on the German line. He knew Lucas was somewhere down there, maybe preparing for orders of his own, maybe clutching the photograph tucked safely in his coat. "Wherever you are," Thomas whispered inside himself, "I hope you're safe." The distant thunder grew louder, yet the morning light still glowed softly across the snow, reflecting the gentleness of the night they had shared. The gun's shadow had returned, but peace had carved a shape into their hearts, a shape no shadow could fully erase. The day marched on with a slow and heavy tread, the hours unfolding in muted tones. The distant artillery rumbled now and then, never quite close enough to shatter the new stillness, but near enough to remind everyone that the miracle of peace had been only a pause, not an end. By late afternoon, clouds drifted in from the north, thick and gray, settling over the trenches like a woolen blanket pulled too tightly. The light faded quickly, swallowing the soft colors of morning and leaving behind a dim, cold world. Snowflakes fell again, more heavily now, spiraling in weary loops as dusk crept across the horizon. Thomas sat on an overturned crate near the trench wall, pulling his coat tighter around his body. The wooden bird Lucas had carved pressed warmly against his chest, a reminder of the night he kept replaying in his mind like a quiet, cherished dream. Around him the soldiers moved with hushed restraint. They cleaned their boots, tended small fires, checked ammunition. All the motions of war, but slower, gentler, as though some invisible weight made each gesture thoughtful. A private stirred a pot of thin stew over a flame that sputtered in the wind. "Funny," he said quietly. "Never thought I'd miss their voices." "Whose voices?" another soldier asked. "The Germans. Last night. They sounded almost like neighbors." A man across from them nodded. "Aye, the trench sounds empty now, like something's missing." Thomas understood. The quiet tonight felt different, too still, not peaceful, lonely. As darkness thickened, lanterns were lit along the trench, their weak glow casting long shadows against the mud walls. The flame flickered in Thomas's periphery, steady but small. He found himself wishing for the lanterns that had dotted the no-man's land the night before, warm little stars fallen to earth. He rested his elbows on his knees and stared upward. Snowflakes drifted through the faint lantern light, melting as they touched his skin. The clouds above hid the stars, leaving the sky blank and heavy. Thomas felt an ache settle in his chest. Just one more night, he thought, just one more hour of peace. But war does not bend to longing. A call traveled down the trench line, routine, firm, familiar. "Night watch to stations." Men rose with quiet resignation. Thomas stood as well, adjusting his rifle strap across his shoulder. His fingers brushed the carved bird again, grounding him. When he reached his post at the firing step, he peered over the frost-crusted edge of the trench. The no-man's land stretched out before him, an expanse of white broken only by faint soft mounds where footsteps had been erased by snow. The decorations they'd left on the barbed wire were barely visible, tiny shapes blurred under the drifting flakes. The German trench across the field was a dark line against the horizon. No music, no laughter, no lanterns, no Lucas, just silence. Thomas's breath fogged before him. He wondered if Lucas had also climbed to his own firing step, if he was looking back across the snow, thinking the same thoughts, remembering the same warmth. A nearby soldier muttered, "Feels colder tonight." Another replied softly, "That's because peace is gone." The words sank into the evening air like stones into deep water. Thomas leaned forward slightly, scanning the German line. For a heartbeat he imagined he saw a shape moving, someone rising just enough to look out over the snow. His pulse quickened, but the figure disappeared before he could be sure. Still, he hoped. Hours crept by, slow and heavy. Snow thickened, muffling every sound, wrapping the world in white silence. The lanterns flickered, casting trembling shadows. And through it all, Thomas held the memory of the night close, like a flame cupped gently in the hands, protected from wind and time. The truce was gone, but its warmth lived quietly in the cold. When his watch ended, Thomas stepped down from the firing step, his boots sinking into soft snow. As he walked back toward his bunk, he whispered into the freezing air, "Good night, Lucas." His breath vanished into the darkness, but the words remained, echoing softly in his heart. The night pressed heavily upon the trenches, thick with falling snow and the muted heartbeat of a world circling back toward war. The lanterns flickered low, their light gilding the mud walls with faint, trembling gold. Most of the soldiers had settled into their narrow bunks or crouched beside small fires, seeking warmth wherever they could find it. Thomas lay wrapped in his blanket, though sleep felt distant, unreachable. His breath rose in pale clouds with every exhale, fading into the darkness above him. He clutched the tiny wooden bird in his hand, its wings smoothed by Lucas's careful carving. The small figure felt warm now, warmer than the air around him. its presence a gentle reassurance against the cold weight of returning duty. Around him, soft murmurs drifted through the trench. A private whispered to another, "Do you think it'll ever happen again? A truce like that?" His companion sighed, "Probably not. But I'll tell my children about it, that's for certain." A soldier farther down added quietly, "We saw what the world could be, even if just for a night." The words sank deep into Thomas's chest. He closed his eyes, letting the memories return, not the harsh ones, but the warm ones. Lanterns glowing in soft halos, laughter rising like sparks into the night, the scent of shared bread and wine, voices blending in song until the whole battlefield hummed with fragile unity. And Lucas's gentle smile in the morning light. Thomas turned slightly on his cot, staring up at the faint outline of the trench roof. His body was tired, bone-deep, weary, but his heart felt strangely alert, as if holding vigil over something sacred. He imagined Lucas doing the same, somewhere across the snowy expanse, perhaps kneeling in the German trench, writing one last note in his journal, or gently touching the photograph Thomas had given him. An ache spread through Thomas's chest. Not sharp, not painful, just full, so full it pressed gently against his ribs like a soft aching reminder of connection. He whispered into the cold darkness, "Are you safe, Lucas?" The words drifted upward and vanished, but speaking them brought him a quiet comfort. A few soldiers nearby talked about what they would write in their next letters home. Others lay awake, staring upward, their thoughts wandering along the edges of that miraculous night. And some, unable to speak their feelings aloud, held small tokens from the Germans in their hands, thumbed them with reverence, and tucked them beneath their pillows like tiny anchors against the storm of war. Thomas breathed in slowly, letting his eyes close. The snow outside muffled everything, every distant boom, every shifting footstep, until the world sounded like a blanket tucked around exhausted shoulders. He felt the trench beneath him, cold and unforgiving, but he also felt the memory of no man's land, warm with voices and candles pressed against his heart like a second heartbeat. Peace had been brief, just one night, shimmering like a single star glimpsed through clouds, but it had changed something inside him. It had shown him the truth he would carry for the rest of his life, that even in the darkest places, kindness can appear like a flame, small, trembling, but strong enough to warm an entire field of snow. The wind brushed gently along the trench lip, sending a soft trickle of powder drifting downward. Thomas opened his eyes one last time and gazed at the delicate flakes falling through the air. He imagined they carried whispers of the night with them, songs and laughter, handshakes and shared meals, hopes spoken softly between strangers. And as he finally felt sleep tug at the edges of his mind, he held the wooden bird close and breathed out a final quiet thought. Tomorrow may bring war, but I will remember peace. Morning returned slowly, hesitantly, as though the sun itself felt reluctant to rise over a world that had held such fragile peace only a day before. Pale light seeped into the trenches, brushing the wooden planks with a soft glow. Frost coated everything, rifles, boots, the edges of discarded tins, turning the harsh landscape into something deceptively gentle. Thomas rose from his cot, stretching stiff limbs, and blinked up at the gray sky above the trench lip. Snow still drifted in lazy spirals, softening the sharp lines of the morning. Despite the cold, he felt warmth pulse faintly in his chest, a warmth he carried from the night before. Around him the soldiers moved in quiet rhythms, preparing for another day. No one spoke loudly, No one barked jokes across the trench. Their voices were low, reverent, as though they still stood inside the echo of something sacred. Then, without warning, a sharp whistle cut through the air. The first true command of the day, the signal that the truce was not just over, it was gone. A British artillery piece, far behind the lines, fired a shell that streaked overhead with a cold, whistling cry before exploding somewhere beyond the German trench. The ground trembled faintly beneath Thomas's boots. The war had returned. A German shell answered moments later, bursting in a cloud of smoke and frozen earth closer than Thomas wished. Men ducked instinctively, though no one screamed, no one panicked. The shock did not erase the night they had shared, it only sharpened the contrast. Thomas lifted his rifle, feeling its weight settle into his arms. But something inside him resisted, not in a way he could show, not in a way he could express, but in a way that lived quietly beneath his heartbeat. He climbed the firing step and peered once more across the snow-covered field. The German trench lay ahead, darker now, braced, awake. He scanned the line, searching without knowing exactly what for. And then he saw movement. A small figure, just tall enough to peek over the German parapet. Lucas. Their eyes met across the distance, an instant of recognition in a world that demanded they become strangers once again. Lucas did not wave, neither did Thomas. But they held each other's gaze for that brief, impossible moment, letting all the warmth of the night pour into a single look. Lucas touched the edge of his coat, where the photograph lay hidden. Thomas touched his pocket, where the wooden bird rested. A silent promise passed between them. I remember. I will carry this. You are not my enemy. Another shell flew overhead. Both men ducked, though not out of fear, out of instinct. When Thomas looked again, Lucas was gone, swallowed by the trench below. The moment had passed. War had resumed. But something within Thomas felt unbreakable now. As the day unfolded in smoke and thunder, Thomas fought when ordered, hid when needed, moved when commanded, but never with the same mind as before. Behind every sound, every burst of gunfire, every operation, he carried the memory of lanterns glowing in the snow, of hands shaking across barbed wire, of songs rising into the winter sky, of two soldiers sharing stories instead of bullets, and he believed quietly that Lucas carried the same memory in his own heart. That belief helped Thomas endure the harsh days that followed, the long nights, the cold, the fear. He knew he could not stop the war. None of them could. But he realized something profoundly true. War had shown him how fragile men could be, but peace, brief, miraculous peace, had shown him how strong they could be, too. When the guns roared again, the sound felt hollow compared to the laughter that once filled the same field. When the officers shouted orders, their voices felt thinner than the song that had woven itself across the lines. And when night came again, dark and cold, Thomas held the wooden bird in his hand and whispered into the shadows, "I'll never forget." And in a trench not far away, Lucas pressed a folded photograph to his heart and murmured something in German, words of memory, of warmth, of hope. The war would take many things, but it could never take the night when peace walked the battlefield. It could never take the moment when enemies chose to see each other as men, and it could never erase the bond formed in a snowy field on Christmas Eve. Peace had lasted only a night, but it had lived forever in their hearts. Thank you, dear listener, for journeying through this quiet, fragile moment of history. A night when war paused, when hope flickered like candle flame, and when humanity found its voice again in the snow. As you rest now, let your breath soften. Let your thoughts drift gently like falling flakes. Hold close the truth that even in the darkest times, peace can find us. In kindness, in memory, in connection. If this story brought you comfort, warmth, or reflection, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. May your night be peaceful, your dreams gentle, and your heart calm. Sleep well.